Turin, Italy, January 3rd, 1889. A tall, thin man with an enormous mustache covering his mouth crosses the Piazza Carlo Alberto in the middle of a cold winter afternoon. He stops suddenly. He sees, in the middle of the square, a coachman whipping an old horse that's unable to pull the cart. Without saying a word, the man runs across the street, throws himself around the animal's neck, and starts to cry. He cries out loud. He cries as if something were being torn out from inside him at that exact moment. The people around stop to look. A police officer slowly approaches. The man slides down, falls to the ground, and passes out right there, hugging the horse. When he wakes up, days later, his mind will never come back again. He will spend the next 11 years of his life in almost absolute silence, cared for by his elderly mother in a small house in Germany. He will never write another line. The name of this man was Friedrich Nietzsche. And 3 years before that collapse in the middle of the street, he had published the most precise warning ever formulated about the cost of facing what terrifies a human being. The sentence is hidden in the middle of hundreds of others, inside aphorism 146 of the book Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886. It says that whoever fights with monsters must be careful not to become himself a monster. And it continues, if you look for too long into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you. Everyone has already seen this sentence somewhere, stuck on a wall, tattooed on a piece of skin, printed on a cheap t-shirt, but almost nobody understands what it really says. Even fewer notice the sinister coincidence that exists between this warning and the fate of the very man who wrote it. He was trying to save whoever would read it. He couldn't save himself. He was swallowed by the abyss he described. And what he saw before being swallowed is exactly what most people today are beginning to see, without knowing how to name it. Nietzsche wasn't writing for people who like pretty quotes. He was writing for a man who didn't yet fully exist back then, but who today is all of us. The tired, distracted adult, surrounded by the blue light of screens, cut through by silent notifications, incapable of enduring a single minute of silence inside his own head. The one who feels, deep in the night, when the noise stops, that something is terribly wrong with the way he's living, but can't quite point to what exactly. This is the story of that warning. It's the story of what he predicted would happen to us. And it's the story of how a man who dared to look into the void before any other philosopher in the West paid, with his own sanity, the price of that courage. To understand the abyss, you first have to understand what Nietzsche was seeing when he wrote that. He wasn't talking about evil in the Christian sense. He wasn't describing a temptation, a sin, an inner demon in the old format. The abyss, for him, was something else. It was the emptiness of meaning that appears when a human being, with brutal honesty, begins to question his own inherited certainties. It's what's left when someone removes, one by one, the layers of beliefs, truths, and values he received for free at birth. Beneath these layers, he said, there is no solid ground waiting. There is a bottomless bottom, an absolute silence. A question nobody wants to ask. What if there is no meaning at all beneath any of this? What if the meaning of life is something that always had to be invented, sustained, constructed? What if nobody, anywhere, is holding the ends together for us? This silent hole is the abyss, and it's open beneath everyone's feet all the time, even for those who pretend not to notice. What makes this aphorism so dangerous is exactly this. It doesn't describe something distant. It describes a state most people experience at precise moments and then back away from in a hurry. It's the instant when someone wakes up in the middle of the night and no longer knows why they work so hard. It's the moment when a person finishes a long TV series, turns off the screen, and feels a damp emptiness rise from the chest. It's the awkward pause between two tasks on an ordinary day, when suddenly there's nothing to say, even to your own mind. In these instants, the abyss winks into life. Nietzsche understood that the entire civilization was being built so that these pauses would never happen, and that's why he warns us, because if you don't learn to look at the abyss with preparation, something worse than it happens. you start to become like it. Empty on the inside, cold, cynical, without a center. A small mirror of everything you didn't want to face head on. Later, philosophers and sociologists took this diagnosis further. Robert Putnam, in the book Bowling Alone, published in 2000, described how Western societies had lost, over the course of half a century, almost all the community structures that gave silent support to people's lives. Empty churches, closed clubs, anonymous neighborhoods, distant families. Each of these absences, on its own, seems small. Added together, they produce exactly the scenario in which the abyss Nietzsche spoke of stopped being an exceptional experience and became an everyday landscape. Emptiness today is no longer a rare shock in a moment of crisis. It's the permanent backdrop of an entire life. And when this backdrop becomes permanent, the human being has to develop constant strategies of anesthesia just to be able to get out of bed in the morning. That's why the consumption of digital content has grown so uncontrollably in the last 2 decades. It's not just a habit, it's medication. It's the on-call remedy for a pain of existing that nobody knows how to name out loud anymore. The starting point of everything Nietzsche wrote, however, is an event he described almost prophetically before the whole world could see what was happening. In paragraph 125 of the book, The Gay Science, published in 1882, he presents a strange scene. A man comes running into a public square with a lantern lit in broad daylight, shouting that he's looking for God. The people around laugh. They aren't religious. They think of themselves as modern, enlightened, superior. And it's precisely to them that the madman turns with glassy eyes and announces, "We killed him, you and I, and now we all have blood on our hands." Nietzsche isn't celebrating this murder. He's describing a collective trauma that was still to come. Science, the Enlightenment, industrialization, all of that had pulled out from under Western man the certainty that there was a divine order taking care of every step, every tragedy, every choice. But nobody had yet realized the hole that was left in its place. That hole is the same abyss of aphorism 146. It's the same silent absence he describes in other texts. Nietzsche saw, with painful clarity, that the West was becoming orphaned without knowing it. People kept working, getting married, having children, building houses, buying things. But the engine underneath all of this, the deep reason why these gestures made sense, had disappeared. Christianity, metaphysics, absolute truths, cosmic order, all of that was still mentioned, but nobody believed in it anymore with their whole body. And the body, when it doesn't believe, starts getting sick in a way medicine doesn't know how to name. Coming up, in his view, was a whole era in which human beings would have to decide what to do with the emptiness that was left. Either they would invent new cheap gods full of shine to plug the hole, or they would learn, with a lot of pain, to create new meanings with their own hands. There was no comfortable middle ground. And the wrong choice, he already knew, would be the most likely one. It's worth paying attention to which cheap gods were invented in its place. The cult of visible professional success, measured in job titles, salaries, and addresses. The worship of the perfect body, chiseled through hours at the gym and cosmetic clinics. The frantic pursuit of photographable experiences, more to be displayed than to be lived. The veneration of public figures turned into plastic idols, whose lives became consumption scripts for millions of anonymous spectators. Each of these modern altars occupies crudely the space that used to be occupied by an entire cosmology. And each of them, being cheap, wears out fast. You have to switch gods frequently. One month it's the influencer, the next it's the new wellness routine, the one after it's the productivity philosophy of the moment. Modern man became a collector of disposable altars and still keeps feeling that something essential is missing. Nietzsche predicted this with embarrassing precision. He knew that, without facing the void head-on, the Western adult would spend his whole life buying substitutes that would never do the job. What he predicted for this wrong choice has a precise name: passive nihilism. It's a concept that appears in notes gathered after his death, especially in the material that gave rise to the book The Will to Power. and also in letters and essays from his final years. Passive nihilism is the state of someone who, faced with the void, decides to do nothing with it. He doesn't rebel, doesn't build, doesn't protest, doesn't search. He just sinks. Except this sinking is elegant, silent, almost invisible. It doesn't look like sinking. It looks like routine. It looks like tiredness. It looks like modern life working just fine. Any adult, in any big city in the United States or Europe, wakes up before 6, checks his phone while still lying down, absorbs headlines he didn't choose to read, cuts through traffic listening to a podcast about productivity, works 8 hours in a chair, comes home, heats up a ready-made meal, sits on the couch, opens a short video app, and spends another 2 hours scrolling a screen until he falls asleep. He would say, if you asked him, that he's fine, that he's tired, but fine, that life is just like that nobody has time, that tomorrow there's more of it. That's passive nihilism in its pure state. It's not clinical depression, though it can lead to it. It's not laziness, though it looks like it. It's a collective anesthesia against the abyss. Nietzsche anticipated this behavior decades before there was a single screen lighting up a human face in the middle of the night. He understood that, without a deep meaning to hold life together, modern man would seek out ever faster, cheaper, easier to consume distractions. He would seek out small emotions so as not to feel the big emotion of his own existence. He would consume everything, but wouldn't manage to digest anything. He would trade the search for meaning for the search for entertainment. And deep down, he would know he's running away. He just wouldn't be able to stop, because stopping means looking. And looking means seeing the abyss, returning the gaze. And seeing that, unprepared, is unbearable. So he keeps scrolling, keeps clicking, keeps switching tabs, keeps putting off the only question that matters. And the abyss, calmly, keeps feeding on that escape. The American writer David Foster Wallace, in a famous speech given in 2005 at Kenyon College, put this problem in another way, but pointed to the same wound. He said that everyday adult life is a disguised desert of boredom, and that the only real choice a person has is to decide what to put at the center of that existence so as not to die inside. If the center is consumption, he warned, consumption will devour you. If it's the approval of others, that approval will never be enough. If it's money, it will always fall short. The absence of a consciously chosen center, he said, produces a specific kind of death in life that looks a lot like the passive nihilism described by Nietzsche more than a century earlier. Wallace, by the way, would tragically end his own life a few years after that speech, which only gave the warning more weight. The abyss, when ignored for too long, doesn't disappear. It just waits. And it charges the bill when the energy of the anesthesia runs out. There's a specific figure Nietzsche created to describe this kind of human being. He appears for the first time in the prologue of the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published in 1883, and is called The Last Man. The last man isn't the villain of the story. He's worse than that. He's the comfortable guy. The one who, according to Nietzsche himself, invented happiness and blinks his eyes proudly when he says so. The last man doesn't want to conquer anything great. He doesn't want to take risks. He doesn't want to love in a crazy way. Doesn't want to create art that hurts. Doesn't want to pursue uncomfortable truths. He wants comfort. He wants security. He wants predictability. He wants enough not to suffer, but never enough to transform himself. When Zarathustra comes down from the mountain to announce this figure, he expects horror from the crowd. He expects people to be shocked, to be ashamed, to swear they'll never be that. But what happens in the scene is exactly the opposite. The crowd cheers. The crowd asks for it. The crowd says, "Give us that last man. That's what we want to be." That scene, written back in the 19th century, is today an almost embarrassing mirror. The last man is the adult who takes pride in having a stable life, but never really wanted to know if he's actually alive. He's the professional who piles up titles without ever asking if what he does matters. He's the consumer who trades in his device every year just to feel that something new happened. He's the person who confuses comfortable survival with fullness. Nietzsche saw with pain that this type of human would multiply uncontrollably because he's the easiest one to produce. All you have to do is offer enough comfort and remove every demand for greatness. All you have to do is convince people that taking risks is crazy, that suffering is failure, that chasing something bigger is immaturity. That's how you mass produce this polished adult. And he never knows he's that. He thinks he's normal. He thinks he's sensible. He even thinks he's happy. But underneath, the abyss is still there, looking back. And he doesn't even have the courage anymore to look away. He's lost that energy. The most silent tragedy of this comfortable human type is the way he talks to himself. He comes to see any inner unease as a mistake to be eliminated, and not as a signal to be listened to. When he feels something is wrong, he checks an app that promises calm in 5 minutes. When something inside him screams, he puts on headphones. When an uncomfortable thought shows up, he opens the fridge. With each gesture like that, he trains his own brain to see restlessness as a medical symptom, something to be suppressed, and never as a possible message from a deeper part of himself asking for change. Nietzsche understood that the great victory of the last man over humanity would be exactly this: convincing everyone that discomfort is a disease and not a summons. And once that belief settles in, the possibility of real transformation is practically cut off. Because the raw material of transformation always was, is, and always will be discomfort. Without discomfort, nobody changes. Anesthetizing discomfort is signing a contract with stagnation for the rest of your life. Behind the last man, there's a whole value system holding up this way of living. Nietzsche calls it herd morality. This concept shows up strongly in Beyond Good and Evil and is deepened in another fundamental work of his on the genealogy of morality, published in 1887. The central idea is this: most of what a society calls good, correct, decent, respectable didn't come from a divine revelation or from an eternal truth. It came from the need to keep a group cohesive. It came from the structural logic of protecting the majority against everything that would be too much for them to bear. The herd doesn't like individuals who are too strong. It doesn't like talents that expose the mediocrity of others. It doesn't like people who ask questions nobody wants to hear. So it creates, without realizing, a whole system to water down these figures. It calls strength arrogance. It calls courage irresponsibility. It calls difference a sickness. It calls solitude social failure. It's worth paying attention to how this manifests today, right in the middle of modern market dynamics. Social media rewards those who fit in. Professional environments reward those who don't make waves. Groups of friends, schools, families, all operate, in different degrees, under this herd logic. The price of belonging seems small on the surface, but very high in the accumulation. A piece of the personality tucked away here, an opinion softened there, a desire hidden somewhere else, a dream abandoned so as not to seem arrogant, a passion discarded so as not to seem weird. At the end of 20 years living like that, what's left is a polished, accepted, functional adult, completely a stranger inside his own body. Nietzsche looked at this process with a rare sadness. He understood that the herd offers real protection against the abyss, but charges in return a very expensive currency, the very soul of whoever submits. You pay with pieces of yourself, and one day you look inside and no longer find whoever used to be there. You only find echoes of the opinions you swallowed, fears you inherited, values you never chose. It's another kind of emptiness, maybe the scariest one, because it's an emptiness with your name written on the ID badge. There is, however, a side effect of this whole scheme that is perhaps the most destructive one in all of modern philosophy. Nietzsche baptized it as resentment. The term appears strongly in On the Genealogy of Morality and describes a specific poison that accumulates in people who, incapable of acting on their own pain, poison the world around them with judgment, envy disguised as morality, constant cynicism, and a hidden wish to see others fall. The resentful person is a precise psychological figure. He's not just someone sad. He's someone who turned his own powerlessness into an identity. He couldn't be strong, so he decided that being strong is bad. He couldn't be beautiful, so he decided that beauty is vanity. He couldn't be rich, so he decided that anyone with money is always corrupt. He couldn't be happy, so he decided that anyone who seems happy is lying. Resentment isn't an opinion. It's a lens through which the resentful person reads everything that happens around him. And that lens distorts reality to the point of making the whole world seem, to him, like a personal injustice. The most dangerous thing about resentment is that it disguises itself as virtue. The resentful person rarely sees himself as bitter. He sees himself as lucid, as someone who finally saw, after so many stumbles, how the world really works on the inside. And from that supposed lucidity, he starts presenting himself as a person of principle, with sharp critical sense, high standards. But underneath that appearance of moral superiority, there's a small flame of hatred silently burning, a wish to see the other person stumble, a discreet pleasure when someone who is doing well suddenly falls, an almost physical relief when discovering that the admired person had a hidden flaw. Nietzsche digs deep into this point because he understands that resentment is the abyss, installing itself inside the human soul and rewriting its values from the inside. It's the abyss taking over the gaze. And once it settles in, it's almost impossible to pull it out, because the person no longer sees that she's looking crooked. She thinks she's finally seeing clearly. Every cure begins, then, in the most uncomfortable place, in admitting to yourself that maybe some of this poison is circulating in you. The German philosopher Max Scheler wrote, in the essay Resentment in the Building of Morals, published in 1912, a direct continuation of what Nietzsche had identified. Scheler showed how resentment, when it becomes mass culture, doesn't stay isolated in individuals. It contaminates entire institutions, colonizes public discourse, hijacks debates that should be about justice, and turns them into disguised revenge. The contemporary digital environment made this process visible like never before. All you have to do is open any social network for 3 minutes to see this mechanism in action. An anonymous crowd unloads on any given target an amount of rage disproportionate to what that person did. And rarely is this rage about the target. It's about their own powerlessness accumulated over years of a life without accomplishment, without purpose, without the courage to transform their own existence. It's the internal abyss looking for a screen where it can project itself. Whoever takes part in this thinks they're doing justice. Nietzsche would say they're just feeding their own poison, and that, with every round of this feeding, they become more like the thing they hate. Before we continue this journey, a brief pause. Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. Start with the link I left in the first pinned comment. If everything that has been said so far were the end of the story, it would be easy to conclude that Nietzsche was a pessimist, a prophet of the void, a philosopher of despair. But that reading would be a direct betrayal of what he spent his life writing, because for him, the abyss isn't the end, it's the beginning. It's the raw material, it's the rough material from which a true life needs to be forged. Modern man's mistake isn't in having found the void. The mistake is in having stopped there. It's in having accepted the void as the final answer, when it should have been only the starting point for a much more serious question. And to explain how to move beyond that point, Nietzsche turned to two figures he went to look for deep in ancient Greek culture, long before any Christian morality or Enlightenment rationalism existed. These two figures appear in his first published book, The Birth of Tragedy, from 1872. One is called Apollo, the other is called Dionysus. Apollo represents everything that is form, order, measure, clarity, sunlight filtered through the columns of a temple. Dionysus represents everything that is chaos, drunkenness, vital force, ecstasy, delirium, dancing until you drop. Nietzsche argues that great Greek tragedy, the highest art humanity had produced up to that point, existed precisely because it managed to unite these two forces in the same work. Without the Dionysian, art becomes decoration. Without the Apollonian, art becomes noise. Without both together, there is no truth. And human life works by the same logic. An existence that is entirely Apollonian, controlled, planned, predictable, is an existence that has fled from its own blood, an existence that is entirely Dionysian, uncontrolled, given over to impulse, without form, is an existence that destroyed itself before flourishing. You need both. You need to descend one day into chaos and come back from there with something formed in your hands. What Nietzsche is saying is that modern man has a mortal fear of Dionysus. He only wants Apollo. He wants only the spreadsheet, the routine, the control, the weather forecast, the algorithm that decides what to watch. He runs from everything that is excess, mystery, ecstasy, raw contact with his own vital force. And in running from the Dionysian, he runs from exactly the part of life that gives density to it. That's why so many people describe their own days as grey, even when, technically, everything is going well. The other side is missing. The plunge is missing. The moment is missing when you cross through something big and come back transformed. The abyss in this reading is the shadowy face of Dionysus. It's the brute force that modern life has learned to avoid, but which keeps calling, insistently, from underneath everything. Whoever runs from it forever ends up, without realizing it, dying little by little on the inside, while still breathing on the outside. There's a sentence from Nietzsche that became famous for reasons similar to the aphorism about the abyss. It appears in the book Twilight of the Idols, published in 1888, one of the last ones he wrote before the collapse. The sentence is short, and everyone has read it somewhere, probably written on gym clothes. It says that what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Out of context, it became a toxic cliché. It's used by people to invalidate other people's pain, to heroize unnecessary suffering, to justify situations that should be abandoned instead of endured. But in the original context, it means something quite different. Nietzsche wasn't saying that any pain strengthens you. He was describing a specific process. When a human being is subjected to a pain that almost breaks him, and he isn't broken, what happens is that this pain becomes part of his inner structure. It turns into strength. It turns into character. It turns into depth. It turns into what others will call, later on, presence. This kind of strengthening isn't automatic. Nietzsche was very clear about that. There are sufferings that destroy without building anything. There are pains that amputate permanently. There are experiences that devastate without offering redemption. What he describes is a possibility, not a guarantee. And that possibility only happens when the suffering is crossed with a specific attitude. The attitude of someone who doesn't run, doesn't anesthetize himself, doesn't outsource to a screen or a substance the task of forgetting. When someone, inside his own pain, finds the courage to ask what that pain can teach him about himself, about the world, about what needs to be transformed from that point on, then the alchemy happens. Then suffering becomes a forge. It becomes the instrument by which character is shaped. In Ecce Homo, also written in 1888 and published later, Nietzsche goes even further and writes that we should be grateful even for the deepest pains, because they were the ones that allowed us to be who we became. This isn't masochism. It's the understanding that a life without contact with the abyss is a life without contour. And a life without contour isn't really a life. It's a sketch. The Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Second World War concentration camps, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, published in 1946, a sentence that dialogues directly with this idea of Nietzsche's. He said that whoever has a why to live can bear almost any how. Frankl, by the way, cited Nietzsche himself at this point because he had noticed in the camps that the prisoners who resisted the longest, even under impossible conditions, weren't necessarily the physically strongest. They were the ones who still kept on the inside a deep reason to get through it, an unfinished project, a person who needed to be found, a mission that was asking to be fulfilled. Suffering didn't lose its brutality, but it gained a place within a larger narrative, and with that place, it became bearable. Whoever lost that why also lost the ability to endure. That distinction separated survivors from victims. It's a practical, almost clinical version of the philosophy Nietzsche had formulated decades earlier while looking at his own sick body. which was with him his whole life. There's a specific thought experiment Nietzsche created to test whether a human being is really living this way or just going through the days. It's hidden in the middle of a book that almost nobody finishes reading, and it's capable of revealing in less than a minute whether a life is being lived or merely endured. It appears for the first time in paragraph 341 of The Gay Science, and then returns with force in Zarathustra. It's known as the thought of the eternal return. The scene is this. Imagine that, at some point, a demon comes up to you in the middle of the night, when the house is silent and no one can see. He tells you that this life, exactly this one you are living now, with every tiny detail, every humiliation, every cup of coffee, every unanswered message, every afternoon of boredom, every instant of joy, will have to be lived again. Not once. Infinite times, without changes, without improvements, without erasing what hurts, without keeping only what pleases. Exactly the same, forever. And he asks you, do you accept it? The purpose of that question isn't philosophical in the academic sense. It's clinical. It's a diagnosis. Nietzsche is using the thought as a kind of exam to test the inner health of whoever answers. Because if the answer is an immediate horror, an urge to run away, a panic at imagining reliving the present forever, that means the person isn't in agreement with her own life. It means she is just tolerating the days, pushing through, holding on, waiting for something to improve. It means the current existence is, for her, a sentence she accepts out of a lack of courage to transform it. And if that is the answer, the thought of the eternal return works like a sharp slap in the face. A call, a warning that the life being lived right now isn't worthy of being made eternal, and therefore, it needs to change. It needs to change from the inside out, starting with the attitude with which you wake up each morning. What Nietzsche is proposing behind this experiment is a complete reform of the human relationship with the present. It's not about changing your life from the outside, switching jobs, moving to another city, starting from scratch. It's about changing the way you inhabit each minute. It's about living right now, an instant you would accept to relive eternally, an instant you wouldn't trade for any other, an instant in which you aren't running from yourself, or anesthetizing yourself, or betraying yourself. This kind of instant is rare, and that's exactly why most people would live in dread when faced with the demon's question. Because almost nobody is building a life that would be worth reliving eternally. Almost everyone is just piling up days, hoping the years will pass without too much suffering. And the abyss, silent, watches this giving up disguised as routine. And looking for a long time, the abyss returns the gaze exactly because the person isn't offering anything more to it than her own emptiness. From that same question also arises the most powerful answer Nietzsche ever formulated. It has a short name in Latin, amor fati, love of fate. It appears strongly in The Gay Science and in Ecce Homo, where he says that his formula for human greatness is not to want anything different, not forward, not backward, not for all eternity, to love every event as if it were necessary, to love even what hurts, because it was what brought you where you are. This isn't resignation. It isn't saying that everything is beautiful. It isn't ignoring injustice, suffering, tragedy. It's something else. It's ceasing to spend energy fighting against what has already happened. It's stopping the mental rewriting of the past. It's accepting life in the exact form in which it appeared, with the raw material it offered, and deciding to do something with that material, instead of spending your whole life complaining about it. Amor fati transforms the relationship with the abyss in a way that seems impossible for those who haven't lived it yet, because the person who loves her own fate no longer has to look away from the void. She can look inside it without being swallowed. She knows that whole is part of the terrain she walks on. She knows the void isn't her enemy. It's part of the landscape she inhabits. She knows that the only way to cross through existence is to integrate everything it contains, including what hurts. And once that integration happens, something changes in the way of walking. The person is no longer terrified by small uncertainties. She doesn't crumble in the face of a setback. She doesn't confuse the temporary fall of a project with the end of her own worth. She develops an inner solidity that doesn't depend on outside fluctuations. And that solidity, which from the outside looks like calm, tranquility, presence, is the direct result of having crossed through the abyss instead of running from it. It's important to point out what amor fati is not. It isn't passively accepting injustice. It isn't giving up all will to change what can be changed. It isn't a philosophical version of conformism. Nietzsche was the opposite of a conformist. Amor fati operates on another layer. It has to do with the consummated past and the inescapable present. What has already been? What now, in the exact instant you read this sentence, already is? Over those things, fighting is spending energy on an impossible battle. Over them, what fits is to integrate, absorb, transform them into material for the next step. What is still open, what can still be created, is still the field of action and will. The distinction between one and the other is one of the most practical lessons his philosophy offers, and maybe the hardest one to digest for a culture that spends half of its time lamenting what can no longer be changed, and the other half putting off what still depends only on a decision. There's a specific force inside the human being that Nietzsche identifies as the engine of all this. He calls it the will to power. It's a concept that appears in several of his books, especially in the writings that were left unpublished and organized after his death in the volume known as The Will to Power. A lot of people misunderstand this expression. They think it's a will to dominate others, a will to power in the political, authoritarian, oppressive sense. It's not. Will to power, in the most serious reading of his work, is the raw inner force that pushes any living being to expand its own capacity, to overcome its own limit, to create something new from its own structure. It's the same force that makes a plant crack the concrete to reach the light. It's the same force that makes a child learn to walk by falling 1,000 times. It's the same force that, in an adult, shows up as a persistent restlessness to become something bigger than he already is. The problem is that the will to power in modern man is almost always blocked. It exists, it's there, but it's buried under fear, under comparison, under other people's opinions, under exhaustion, under routine, under the excessive consumption of stimuli that drain the soul without feeding anything inside. When that force doesn't find a creative outlet, it rots. It becomes resentment. It becomes envy. It becomes acid criticism of the world. It becomes heavy laziness. It becomes that strange state in which the person wants to do something great, knows he wants to, feels it in his skin, but can't move a single finger in that direction. Nietzsche understood that finding this force again was the first real step to crossing the abyss. Because once it's reactivated, the void stops being a sentence. It becomes raw material. It becomes exactly the open field in which that force can throw itself to build something that didn't exist before. The herd sees the void as a threat to be plugged up. The strong individual sees it as the only space in which creation is possible. There's a subtle but decisive difference between desire and will to power. Desire is satisfied in acquisition. Will to power is satisfied in expansion. Desire wants the object. Will wants the process. Whoever acts out of desire buys the new car and is disappointed 3 weeks later because the object hit the target and the target disappeared. Whoever acts out of will to power chooses projects that expand day after day his own capacity to act on the world. He doesn't chase objects. He chases a constant widening of his own reach. It's a difference that seems small on paper, but in real life, it separates two absolutely distinct biographies. The first is that of someone who grows old disappointed, piling up achievements that never filled anything. The second is that of someone who grows old, surprised at himself, looking back and seeing with difficulty how different he became from that lost teenager 30 years ago. Nietzsche wished, for himself and for his readers, this second biography, not as a reward, as the natural consequence of choosing the will to power over the canned desire of the marketplace. To reactivate this force, however, requires a condition modern life has practically forbidden. A condition most people today see as a symptom of social failure, and which, in truth, is the antechamber to any real transformation. That condition is solitude. Nietzsche explores it strongly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, especially in the passages where Zarathustra withdraws to the mountain, stays 10 years in isolation, and only then comes down to try to transmit what he learned. Solitude, for him, isn't a punishment. It's a workshop. It's the space where a human being finally finds his own voice, without the constant interference of other people's voices. It's the silence in which you separate what you actually think from what you're merely repeating out of habit. It's the void of stimuli in which an original idea can be born. Nietzsche doesn't idealize solitude. He recognizes that it hurts. He recognizes that it isolates. He recognizes that it can make sick anyone who doesn't know how to handle it. Zarathustra speaks several times about the risk of getting lost on the mountain, of forgetting others, of becoming too cold to return. But he is also emphatic in saying that nobody becomes a true individual without going through long periods of withdrawal. Nobody builds his own voice by living inside the choir. Nobody develops depth by listening to noise all day long. And it's exactly this kind of solitude that the hyper-connected world made almost impossible. The ordinary person today spends practically every minute of the day receiving some external stimulus. Notification, message, short video, news, opinion from a stranger, photo from an acquaintance, work demand. This saturation of stimuli looks like company, but it's the opposite of that. It's the abyss disguising itself as agitation. It's the void dressing up as a crowd so it won't be noticed. If the person manages for some reason to make contact with real solitude, something strange starts to happen. First comes the discomfort, the anxiety, the almost uncontrollable urge to pick up the phone just to check if anything happened. Then, if she resists, comes a deeper layer of restlessness. Old thoughts come up, forgotten memories, questions that had been dammed up for years, waiting for space to appear. It's unpleasant, it's even scary, but it's there, inside that discomfort, that the soul finally starts to speak. It's there that the answers to questions the routine had all day long to silence start to emerge. And it's there, above all, that solitude starts to reveal itself as the only place in which that specific human being can discover herself. Not by what her family expects of her, not by what the algorithm suggests she might like, not by what her circle of friends would approve of, but by what she, alone, with her own abyss in front of her, can affirm as being her truth. Contemporary studies in neuroscience confirm something Nietzsche had intuited without instruments. Researcher Marcus Reichel of Washington University in St. Louis identified in the 2000s a specific neural network that activates precisely when the brain is at rest without external stimuli. He called it the default mode network. It's in that network that the most complex processes of integrating experience, self-knowledge, long-term planning, and deep creativity take place. And it's that same network that gets switched off almost automatically whenever a screen is turned on in front of the eyes. Modern man, by filling every free second with digital stimuli, is systematically shutting down the brain mechanism through which he becomes someone. He lives, in other words, with the autopilot of the surface layers and with the chronic shutdown of the deep layers. Nietzsche didn't know these networks, but he described the result with precision. An adult who is functional on the outside and without contour on the inside. Solitude, in this context, stops being a philosophical whim and becomes a biological necessity. Without it, the brain can't even begin the work of sculpting the person it hosts. This process prepares the ground for Nietzsche's most radical formulation of what it means to be human. It appears directly in the prologue of Zarathustra and is one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of modern philosophy. He writes that man is something that must be overcome, that we are a rope stretched between the animal and something he calls the overman, that we are a bridge, not an end. There are many mistaken readings of this passage, some of them even politically dangerous over the course of the 20th century. But the original meaning he defends, when read honestly within the full body of his work, is very specific. He's saying that human nature at the point where we find it, isn't the final version of anything. It's just a stage. It's just the intermediate material between an instinctive origin and a still unexplored possibility. And that the fundamental task of each individual is to cross that bridge, not to interrupt the crossing, not to settle in the middle of it, not to decide that the point where you were born is already enough. The last man, the one we spoke about before, is exactly the one who stopped in the middle of that bridge, who decided that crossing over is too dangerous, who settled into the comforts of the middle of the road and decided to call that the final destination. The man Nietzsche imagines as possible, on the contrary, is the one who keeps walking, who takes the crossing as his life project, who accepts that a whole life is made of successive overcomings of who he was yesterday, not in the name of a competition with others, in the name of a deep loyalty to that force of potency that exists inside him and that always asks for more. In this sense, the abyss isn't the enemy. The abyss is the path itself. It is exactly the void that has to be crossed for the bridge to have a reason to exist. Without an abyss, there's no crossing. Without a crossing, there's no individual. There's a specific expression Nietzsche repeats several times in his work, taken from the Greek poet Pindar, that sums all of this up in a single sentence. He mentions it in The Gay Science and uses it as the subtitle of the book Ecce Homo. The sentence says, "Become what you are." At first glance, it seems simple, almost obvious, but it contains a huge philosophical tension, because it doesn't say discover who you are. It doesn't say find your hidden truth. It doesn't say look inside and observe what was already there. It says become. An active verb, a creator verb. The expression is saying that what a person is, in the deepest sense, isn't something ready waiting to be found. It's something that has to be manufactured, sculpted, produced with work over the years. Nobody discovers themselves. People create themselves. And in the process of that creation, what was latent, in potential, gets revealed as if it had always been there. But it's only revealed because it was made. That distinction seems small, but it changes everything. Because contemporary culture insists on selling the idea that there's a true and hidden version of each person, an authentic self frozen in some corner of the soul, and that all you have to do is look inside to find it. Nietzsche completely disagrees. He thinks that story is a trap, that it produces a whole generation of people standing still, waiting to discover something they are never going to discover, because that isn't how the thing works. The authentic self, for him, is the result of years of courageous decisions, of refusals, of commitments, of gestures that keep sculpting day after day what the person becomes. It's like a sculpture that appears as material is removed from the block. It wasn't ready in there waiting. It was being made by the very act of chiseling. And the raw material of that act is, exactly, the abyss. It's the emptiness of meaning we've been talking about from the start. It's the hole that scares most people. But for those who understand it, that emptiness is the marble in which one's own life is going to be sculpted. That's a complete inversion of the dominant logic in today's personal development spaces. Many popular discourses start from the premise that there's a ready-made, already formed version of the ideal self, and that the journey consists in pulling it out of the rubble. Nietzsche operates in the opposite direction. There's no rubble, there's no frozen self, there's raw material, repeated choices, habits formed over decades, and the possibility, always open, of starting to sculpt at any moment. That's both scary and freeing. Scary because it takes away the comfort of believing that there's a true self waiting to be rescued by a miracle technique. Freeing because it puts agency entirely in the hands of the individual, here and now. There's nothing to find, there's something to build. There's nothing to remember, there's something to decide. There's nothing to be rescued. You have to pick up the chisel. And in that act repeated over years, what the person becomes starts to appear with sharper and sharper contours, until the point when the others around start to notice that something has changed, without knowing exactly what. And so we arrive at the point where the opening sentence of the video reveals its full meaning. When you look into the abyss, The abyss looks back at you. Yes, it looks, and it will keep looking. There is no way to inhabit an honest life without crossing gazes with that void at some point. Everyone who took a deep breath and saw his own condition for 2 minutes felt that gaze coming back. Nietzsche's warning was never to look away. The warning was not to look in a passive, resigned, defeated way, seeking confirmation that life isn't worth it. Whoever looks like that gets swallowed, turns into resentment, turns into the last man, turns into nihilism in the form of chronic exhaustion, turns into just another person consuming his own existence as if it were content to kill time with. The right gaze is another one. It's the gaze of someone who understands that that void is the very material of the life that has to be created. It's the gaze of someone who, upon seeing the abyss, starts to build something in it. An idea, a value, a work, a version of himself, a crossing. Modern man hasn't lost the ability to look into the abyss. He has lost the ability to look without despair. He has lost the inner repertoire to transform the void into a starting point. And that's what Nietzsche, in the end, offers as his most precious gift. A repertoire, a set of tools to cross through your own hole without destroying yourself in the middle. The death of God doesn't have to be the end. Passive nihilism doesn't have to be your fate. The last man doesn't have to be the only available model. Herd morality can be questioned. Resentment can be detected and drained. The Dionysian can be reintegrated. Suffering can be borne with dignity. The eternal return can become a call. Amor fati can reorganize your attitude toward the present. The will to power can be reactivated. Solitude can become a workshop. Life can go back to being a bridge you cross, and not a confinement in which you grow old. That's a long crossing, made in silence, without an audience, without visible prizes, without external confirmations in the first years. It's a work nobody is going to applaud while it's being done, because it's invisible to those on the outside. Only the walker himself knows how much he has crossed. And in the end, what you gain isn't a life without pain. It isn't a life without an abyss. It's a life in which pain no longer destroys and the abyss no longer devours. It's a life in which the gaze keeps crossing with the void, but the two look at each other as partners in the same landscape, and not as predator and prey. This is the point of arrival Nietzsche imagines. And this is the point he offers to anyone willing to read his philosophy as a manual for living, and not as a decorative quote for social media. If this video touched something inside you, leave your like to support the channel, and consider joining the Members Club. See you in the next video.